Hamitaki. This is Nick Estes, just here to do a quick intervention, a post-election analysis, and just a reflection on where we are at, particularly on the left, and where Indigenous movements can sort of play an important role in looking at this particular election and where do we go from here. First of all, I want to sort of recognize that by no means do I support Trump. And in fact, if anyone knows me, has ever seen me on the streets, I was, stridently anti-Trump in 2020 and going back to 2016. This isn't, I think the Republican Party has transformed into something that could be considered, like people call it fascist, but I kind of tend to not use that word because I think in general, settler colonialism is a much more useful framework in understanding US politics, especially political parties and the outcomes of those political parties. Because when we look at it from that perspective, we can also see that Democrats, by and large, fulfill the intent and the goal of a settler colonial project, which is the elimination of the native to take land and resources. Of course, this is incorporated within a broader of white supremacy and capitalist accumulation in terms of suppressing and dividing the working class and specifically racializing elements of that working class. And we can look at just the immense amount of liberal backlash against voters in this country in this particular moment and just shaming them, outright shaming, Black, Latino, men specifically for voting for Trump. And I think that's a really fascinating kind of move because those votes don't even, they pale in comparison when you look specifically at white voters. And more specifically, if you break it down by gender, white women have voted. There are more white women that's the largest demographic that Trump has in terms of people who voted for him, not percentage of white women, but just in general, the overall numbers of voters, right? So instead of I would be the last person to be like, oh, it's white women's fault that Trump is president, but I would say that's where the overwhelming share of his votes actually come from. So as we look and parse out the details of this particular election, I just want to kind of take a step back and critically analyze what's happening here, because there's going to be all kinds of hot takes in this moment, but I think it's important to just really calmly and objectively observe what has happened in the lead up to the election, also in the post-election sort of analysis, what has happened, but also where do we go from here?
Hi, everyone. This is Melanie Yazzie from Red Power Hour. This Native American Heritage Month, please consider empowering Red Media. Indigenous Peoples Day 2024 marks the 5th anniversary of the Red Nation podcast. Our podcast is a collaboration between the Red Nation and Red Media and is produced by Red Media. Red Media exists to fill the need for Indigenous media by and for Indigenous people. We are launching a GoFundMe campaign to gain support for our operational costs. Please consider empowering Red Media's work. You can also continue to support Red Media on Patreon, where you will gain access to bonus episodes of the Red Nation podcast, Red Power Hour, and many more benefits. Your support empowers Indigenous media and our podcasts. Thank you so much. Ahiahet.
I just want to start by saying, Obama, Trump, Biden, these 3 administrations have represented a fundamental and sort of monumental shift in American politics as we understand them in the last several decades. We see the United States as an empire in decline. Just because it's an empire in decline doesn't mean it's less dangerous. And just because there aren't these sort of more overt violent confrontations, it doesn't mean that there aren't, violent confrontations, military, operations that the United States is running. The United States, whether they're engaged in a hot military conflict or not, doesn't really matter because they've implemented unilateral sanctions against 1/3 of the population of the world, which is quite phenomenal. It shows you the sort of recalcitrant nature of U.S. empire, that these economic sanctions, these political sanctions against these countries that are considered, against U.S. hegemony or contravening, this rules-based international order that the United States props up all the time, those sanctions are backed up by military force. It's not just the United States passes a law or pulls a couple levers. People understand that if they cross those sanction lines, that there will be material consequences. There will be a kinetic response by the U.S. And we're seeing this in terms of the U.S.'s support of Israel and its genocide against Palestinians, which is extended to southern Lebanon and Lebanon in general. So we're living in a pretty dire, time, right? And I just want to say that the Biden administration isn't solely responsible for this buildup. This goes back from every administration since the Zionist state of Israel has been created in 1948, and even preceding that, one could argue. So this is a long time coming, and we're seeing the culmination of this sort of support for Israel and its genocide as determining the outcome of this particular election. And we've seen several analysis come out to say, this was a pocketbook and bread and butter issue in terms of how people voted. Well, as we're seeing the election results kind of pour out, Trump has actually received millions less than he did in 2020. So what we're seeing is a mass abstention of the voting population, whether it's for Republicans or whether it's for Democrats. And so what does that mean? Although, we're going to see all these exit polls come out, those exit polls, most people switch votes or, switch sides or cited economic issues as one of the primary reasons they voted for X, Y, and Z candidate, right? So that's great. That tells us who voted, but it doesn't tell us much about who didn't vote. And I don't know if we're ever going to find a sort of scientific study about those who didn't vote, but I can say that mass abstention in U.S. elections is a tradition. The United States has a pretty low voter turnout when compared to its so-called peer nations in the sort of developed European world. So when we think about it from that perspective, we can say okay, so we have, at least more than a third, maybe 40% of the population doesn't actually vote, who can vote. That's quite a substantial amount of people who don't vote in general. Even going back to the 2020 election, when there was record-breaking turnout in terms of people who voted for, who showed up to vote for Biden. This election, we've seen that just completely disappear and dissipate. And before I get to my own sort of, perspectives on that and what I actually think is going on here, I just want to back up a little bit and go back to the 2020 election, because I think it's important to think about. Or actually, let's go back to 2016. 2016 was the year of the Trump campaign. It was also the year of Standing Rock, at least the more confrontational aspects and media, the media sort of headline grabbing spectacle of the water protectors movement. A lot of people felt and thought that the Obama administration would hear the sort of cries of indigenous people in this particular moment and stop this pipeline, and to really kind of turn the leaf, so to speak, for tribal and U.S. relations, when we didn't really see that happen. I mean, we can't really say that the Obama years were the halcyon days of tribal U.S. relations, because Obama's presidency was marred by the Standing Rock protests and his inability to really fundamentally stop that project or to kind of create safeguards to prevent this kind of exploitation and trespass in indigenous land. Of course, we saw Trump really roll back a lot of the sort of advances tribes have made in the last 50 years in this so-called era of Indian self-determination. We saw a sort of recalcitrant Trump put in, people within the Department of Interior who really sold off a lot of tribal lands and federal lands to private investors, to the oil and gas industry to lease that land off. Which was really bad. The Environmental Protection Agency was gutted under Trump. We saw all these awful things happen. Also, we had COVID-19 Tribes really stepped up in terms of their response to COVID-19. We saw high vaccination rates amongst the American Indian population. But going into the Biden presidency, we also saw, like in 2020, this massive uprising against police violence. And this happened in the South. This started in the South side of Minneapolis. I live in Minneapolis, and I've kind of gotten to know the community really well. The 3rd precinct was located in an area that's not predominantly, but has a historic Native population, as well as, it's very diverse in terms of its racial makeup, and it's a very kind of poor working class neighborhood. The police, and a DOJ report that was issued last year, they targeted not only Black people, they targeted Native people, specifically Native youth, at higher rates than any other racial demographic in the city. So the response to George Floyd's execution by a white police officer, it resonated through Indian country, because people knew the South side of Minneapolis, and also many of the police in Hennepin County, where Minneapolis is located, were also the same police that were sent to the Standing Rock protests to police water protectors there. So there was an understanding, at least, that this was our issue in terms of police violence, and the role that police play in a capitalist and colonial society to suppress social movements. The American Indian movement, for example, came out of the South side of Minneapolis. One of its first campaigns was to address police violence against the Native community. I remember Dennis Banks was saying, when I first met him, he said, we were fighting police violence back in 1968, and in 2020, I think it was in 2017 when I first met him, he said, in 2017, we're still fighting police violence, right? So that was the sort of history, and that movement, became an international movement. And I remember that summer, revolution felt like it had come to the United States, at least on the streets. There was massive solidarity. You had like young white kids, putting their lives on the line next to young Black kids and young Native kids. And people of all kinds of backgrounds came out onto the streets. It's pretty powerful. That momentum was very much, there's a long story there, but that momentum was very much captured by the Biden campaign and funneled directly into, the election, or the voter turnout in 2020 that led to that, because people were just so fed up with, Trump and the repression and the racism, etc., that they were willing to, throw their lot in with Biden, at least what he had promised. But if you go back to that time period, Biden wasn't promising much. He didn't promise to defund the police, but people felt as if we chose Biden, he would be an easier opponent to tackle, right? And so Biden takes office, and the first year he's in office, we see a massive amount of repression in the state of Minnesota against water protectors who are fighting the Line 3 pipeline, an indigenous-led movement, again under a Democratic presidency, this time not happening in a Republican-controlled state like North Dakota, but happening in a Democratic-controlled state by the Governor Walz. Under his leadership, you saw a new kind of counterinsurgency campaign deployed against water protectors. That included creating an escrow account for Enbridge, the owners and the builders of the Line 3 pipeline, to put money into, so that they could pay, the state of Minnesota could pay overtime for the police, the deputy sheriffs that were working and policing the pipeline protests. So it was like basically opening up a channel for the pipeline to directly pay and hire the police of Minnesota to police water protectors. And it was an effective tactic. And I'm not going to attribute police repression to the total crushing of the Line 3 struggle, but it did play an important role. There were more arrests. There were, almost 1,000 arrests in the Line 3 pipeline. There were more arrests than the Standing Rock protest that happened in 2016, but it didn't get that much coverage because we had a Democratic presidency, right? So it really kind of zapped the energy of the water protector movement. And I would say that Biden and Walz really, Biden canceled the Keystone XL pipeline for good. But the Line 3 pipeline was a reroute of the Keystone XL pipeline. It's transporting the same tar sands that Keystone XL was supposed to transport, but it was doing it through a majority of the leg of it was happening, or a good portion of the leg of that pipeline was happening in a Democratic controlled state. So why is it that a pipeline is more successful in a Democratic state than it is in a Republican state? And that has, there are many factors that have to do with that. But I would say that I think that, we kind of got the wool pulled over our eyes in terms of Biden's, professed sympathies towards American Indian sovereignty, tribal sovereignty, et cetera, as well as, trying to target and to really clamp down on the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. This also, comes also under his administration. You see the appointment of Deb Haaland, who is a Secretary of Interior, the first Indigenous woman to hold that position. But under this leadership, we have some progressive things coming out in terms of, we have this really kind of historic federal Indian boarding school investigation that she leads. There was two kind of volumes issued, two reports, that were issued in her tenure in the Biden administration. The first comes out and really kind of documents and lays out on the table that this, century and a half policy, federal Indian policy, to remove children from their families and place them into these off-reservation boarding schools went hand in hand with taking Indigenous land and resources and destroying tribal communities. The second volume was issued this year, and Biden, a couple of weeks before the election, issued a formal apology to American Indian boarding school survivors and tribal communities in general. And there's a first apology for boarding schools that was issued by the United States. That was also rolled into the Kamala Harris campaign, which kind of tainted it for me, because it was on the front page of like the New York Times. I even bought a copy of the New York Times because it's like, wow, this is a pretty newsworthy event. But the New York Times coverage and other newspaper coverage that I saw also rolled it into the fact that like, oh, this is an election, very cynically saying this is an election strategy. Biden went to Arizona to make this announcement and really kind of using Native people as a prop, because Arizona, as we know, was a swing state. So we see this kind of radical momentum happen in 2020, get completely absorbed into the Biden campaign, or not complete, if not absorbed, then, co-opted. And when there are, when we did try to do we chose our opponent, right? So Biden's administration will be much more sympathetic to water protectors' demands. We could just see actually they just turned a blind eye, or they just, refused to listen. They refuse to listen. They're like, yeah, Line 3 is going to happen. We don't care. It's, Minnesota's a progressive state. Like, they do land acknowledgements. Governor Walz has a lieutenant governor who's an Indigenous woman. Like, how could he be racist? That kind of thing, that kind of attitude. So they pushed through this pipeline in a Democratic controlled state when they couldn't push through a similar pipeline in Republican controlled states, right? So what is it? So what are you guys doing? You're saying that you have the power, but you don't have the power to stop these things? Or do Native voices just not matter? That was a huge question that a lot of people had. This is on top of the drastic reduction of life expectancy of American Indians across the board. Initially, coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, they were saying that it was upwards to 7 years nationally that Native people lost 7 years of life expectancy. But more epidemiological studies have come out and suggest that those life expectancy trends, Native people dying earlier than expected, were happening well before the pandemic. And in fact, the state I was born and raised in, South Dakota, American Indians in South Dakota have a median life expectancy of 58 years old. Like, think about that. that report just came out this year. It's not 2 years ago or a year ago. I remember reading, when I first started reading about the American Indian movement, one of their kind of key planks back in like the 1970, I think, there was a report that came out that called Our Brother's Keeper, which was a national report on the socioeconomic conditions of American Indian life in the United States. And they found that the life expectancy of Native people then was 2 decades shorter than the average American in the United States. And I think it was at like 45 years of age, right? So today in 2024, the median life expectancy in South Dakota of an American Indian person is 58 years old. That's almost 2 decades lower than the average life expectancy. So we really have an advantage. And that's not even the same life expectancy of an average American in 1970, right? So it's really hard to point to, if we're just looking at life expectancy alone. I mean, there's a lot of factors that go into that. But if we're pulling that figure out and we're looking at the last like 3 presidential elections, we have to ask ourselves, what the hell is happening? Like, what is leading to the early deaths of Native people? That's a question I just kind of want to bracket off for a second, because I want to think more about, when we talk about the genocide in Palestine as a key topic for voters and a key issue for voters when they're showing up to the polls this week, that was in their minds. Trump is also down millions of voters. He's going to win the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College, but he didn't even pull off his 2020 numbers when he lost to Biden. So we have to ask ourselves what happened. And these exit polls that have been issued already, show that a lot of people are concerned about economic issues. The price of the artificial inflation of prices, specifically of groceries in the United States. The cost of living has gone up. Wages have stagnated. There's a general kind of boot that's being pushed down on poor people in this country. But Native people who have been historically disenfranchised obviously are suffering more in many ways. And I don't want to create an oppression Olympics about this, but I'm just trying to make a point here. So when we think about that issue, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, life didn't radically improve under Biden. Maybe there was some maybe he was just like a little bit less racist than Trump, but his policies didn't fundamentally depart in terms of improving people's lives. He wasn't really that much of an alternative. Harris ran on a campaign that was essentially building off of Biden's successes, right? And they rammed it down our throats that under Biden, the economy was improving. Although the real experiences of everyday people were saying otherwise. They were saying, like, it's impossible to find housing. It's impossible to buy food. It's impossible to take care of my children, etc. Medical costs, education costs are astronomically through the roof. Biden never said he was going to change anything. He also said, nothing will fundamentally change with him. And what's fascinating about that is that typically is what they associate with, progressives, and what the right uses as a cudgel against the left to say, oh, this radical social agenda, it's going to change everything. Democrats in this election, this cycle and the cycle before, took on the small c conservative view that we're going to protect institutions. We're not going to really fundamentally change anything. We're not going to advance legislation. We're just going to protect the status quo. Whereas the right came out and was like, we've normalized Trump era politics. Trump is a main facet of American life, and we're just going to go all in. Trump didn't really have to do much. His voting base didn't really change much. That was kind of set in stone. The difference between 2024 and 2020 from a left perspective is that Biden co-opted the kind of radical movements in the streets, calling for police abolition, calling for, community accountability in terms of state violence against, racialized people and poor people in general. He completely co-opted it. Kamala Harris couldn't and refused to, and Biden himself refused to co-opt the Palestine Solidarity Movement. I don't think that they ever intended to do that, but we saw an utter disdain and a hatred towards people who were pushing for an end to the genocide in Gaza, an end to the genocide in Palestine, and an end to the expansion of Israel's war into Lebanon. So right before the election, we saw progressive forces, people like Bernie Sanders. I think he kind of stands in as the main figure here, saying, well, we have to, he's all in for Kamala. He's like, I don't support her that much, but, I'd rather choose my opponent because then we can introduce arms embargoes, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, you have the presidency, you have a substantial number in the Senate. Why don't you just implement it now? Why don't you stop? Why do we have to wait for an election? It seems like if it's been a year, why haven't you done it now? Because there was never an intention to do it. And so, and also, Sanders, he's a Zionist and he supported Israel. He supported this war. It's like he went all in for Harris. He destroyed his own movement, one that actually offered an alternative. There were many problems with it, but at the end of the day, he could have created a third rail of American politics by creating a new kind of progressive left, politics or party or something, or some kind of movement. But he decided to do the Democrats' bidding at the end of the day, and to allow Biden and Kamala Harris to completely ruin any chance for a ceasefire, to ruin any chance for an arms embargo, to protect Netanyahu from The Hague. That's the truth of the matter. And so when we look at what happened this week, when voters abstained by the tens of millions not voting for either candidate, it was probably one of the largest protest movements that we'll see that we've seen in our generation. It wasn't organized. It was relatively spontaneous. But look at the last year at the Palestine Solidarity Movement. Campuses, universities, schools, institutions, whether they're private or public, have undergone this kind of effort to hold their own accountable. The vast majority of people who live in the United States oppose funding this genocide and fundamentally oppose the genocide. And to say nothing of that number being higher amongst, so-called Democratic supporters. And to ignore that and to platform Bush-era neocons, people who started and were the architects of the U.S. war on terror, institutions that created, or the movement that created institutions like ICE and Homeland Security, some of the most draconian and repulsive anti-immigrant and racist institutions that any country in the world has ever seen. You want to dust off Bush-era neocons to pander to some imaginary kind of Republican who's interested in voting for Democrat because they don't like Donald Trump. Harris raised $1 billion for her campaign. Trump only raised $388 million. And that's what the Democrats decided to spend that money on, was providing cover for genocide. And the cynical nature of it is that they thought people were so stupid that it was a hook, line, and sinker. Oh yeah, we'll just, we'll promise the status quo. In some ways, Harris went further to the right than Biden, but she never fundamentally departed from what his project was. And to think that people were going to fall for that shows you the utter contempt the Democratic elite have for just everyday people and how stupid they think you are. to say that, yeah, they're just gonna rubber stamp this, and we're gonna get elected, and we're just gonna continue on with business as usual. And business as usual right now is like genocide, right? People are smart enough to know that that's the case. And so what people did is they stayed home. They didn't go out to vote. They exercised one of the one power that they had, after trying all these other means to democratically try to stop a genocide. And nothing worked because nobody would listen. And so in some ways, these people are very courageous. Why do I say courageous? Some people might get really upset with me for this video. And I at this point, I don't really care, because it needs to be said. Some people are saying like, oh, they act like they have nothing to lose. The people who stayed home to vote, who stayed home and didn't cast a ballot or abstained from voting, have everything to lose. And they know that. But they also know that this is a strategic move to unseat a genocidal administration, to actually punish the powerful, because these people have no power. They have no power within even, the uncommitted movement had so many problems, right? And we saw that it was kind of like controlled opposition within the Democratic Party. But even that was undermined. Even the very people, the Palestinians, were not even allowed to be on the stage at the DNC. That's how much they hate you. That's how much racism exists within the Democratic Party towards Arab people, towards Muslims, right? So in this moment, people exercised the only power they had, which was to not show up. This is a scary fact, right? They have everything to lose. This is like, the future of the planet is at stake, right? But a president's not going to save the planet. Biden didn't save the planet. In fact, under his administration, he increased oil and gas leasing on federal lands, more so than under the Trump administration, right? So they speak out of two sides of their mouths when it comes to environmental policy, when it comes to oil and gas exploration, when it comes to tribal rights and tribal sovereignty and indigenous sovereignty. We see a buildup under the Biden administration, as we did in the Trump administration, in the Pacific, to encircle China, to exert a threat, to China, to say, hey, don't you dare do whatever you do, because I still don't understand the logic behind it, because our main trading partner still is China. So what are you policing? You're policing the trade lanes that are sending goods to the United States because manufacturing has left. We've seen this bloody, senseless war that the United States has propped up in Ukraine. We see the United States bombing Yemen, still bombing Iraq. Its bombs being used in Lebanon. Its bombs being used in Iran. For what? Like, ask yourself, for what? Do you think people are stupid? I think this particular moment in time opens up, it exposes a crisis that we should take advantage of, and building an alternative to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is going to blame everyone. They're going to blame Black voters. They're going to blame Latino voters. They're going to blame Native voters. They're already blaming me. Like, the responses I've gotten on some of my tweets, which I thought are pretty milquetoast, just demonstrate the utter disdain that these Democratic Party operatives have for voters. And to think that that's going to be the winning sort of magic sauce in upcoming elections, it shows you how out of touch and how bankrupt the Democratic Party is. And so in this moment, it's like our job is to build an alternative. It is to build something that can actually change society and provide a need, the needs for the millions of people who decided not to vote, who decided they're not represented by any political party. And I just kind of want to leave you with that, to think about that in this moment. It's very scary. Like, yeah, I'm like, don't think I'm just so cavalier to be like, yeah, Trump won, haha, Democrats suck. Nobody wants to be right in this moment. And in fact, we are kind of flat-footed because we don't have an alternative. But I will say that people are telling us by their mass abstention from voting where they're at and where they're ready to be in this country and in this moment. And to me, that is so much untapped potential that we have. We spend so much time fighting with the this kind of like corporate media. We spend so much time fighting liberals, and we know that liberals have spent mass amounts of resources just in this last year to defame us, to beat up college students on campuses, to target and investigate people who speak against human rights atrocities, in the other part of the world, to really make us question our own humanity about whether we should support genocide. And tens of millions of people said genocide is a red line for us, and we're not going to support it. And we're not going to show up and vote, and we're not going to give a vote. What liberal democracies say is the most sacred right. We're not going to give that vote to somebody who's going to use it to spend money or to buy or to send, munitions or bombs to kill children. We're just not going to do that. To me, that's a very, very important shift in where we're at as a society. As a country that's complicit in some of the worst human rights atrocities, a country who sits at the head of this imperialist empire and has facilitated the destruction of alternatives to capitalism and imperialism, who has the blood of millions, if not billions, of people on their hands. Like we have a special obligation to not only defeat that machinery that prevents an alternative from arising in other parts of the world and prevents other people's freedoms, but we also need to love ourselves and to provide an alternative for ourselves. And that means, I know some of you are still probably still have some feelings about the Democratic Party. It's like, you're still in love with them. It's like, but like, you got to rip the Band-Aid off, because we can't sit around anymore and wait for people who've committed genocide to join humanity. Maybe they can have some accountability sometime down the road, but I'm more interested in those tens of millions of people who said, hey, this is a red line for me and I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm interested in the people who don't vote. I'm interested in the people who are not engaged in mainstream politics, because I want to know why they're not engaged. I don't care about the liberal pundits, the right-wing pundits. Yes, they will always come after us, and we have to be defensive, and we have to protect our own. We have to do all those things. We have to live in as human beings and be good to each other. Don't get me wrong, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to spend my time worrying about whether a liberal hates me or not, or is seeking to undermine me. What I'm worried about is that kid on the south side of Minneapolis who doesn't have, he maybe feels something. They maybe feel something about this current moment, but they don't have an alternative and they don't see a future for themselves. I'm worried about that kid. I'm worried. I love seeing you all in real life when you come up to me and say, hi, I listened to the podcast. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be native to listen to this podcast. But I just wanted to kind of have this reflection in this moment in time to really think about where we're at. And I want to just read part of a poem. I don't know if I've ever read this on the podcast, but I have this hanging on my office wall. It's called Revolutionary Letter by Wendy Trevino. And at the end, she says, too long, don't read. You don't need or want the people who aren't with you to be with you. Really, you don't. And what she means by this is that, not everyone is going to be on your side, but don't focus on the people who are not on your side. Focus on the people who are on your side or who could be on your side. Don't focus on the people who are always standing in the way. Get them out of the way and focus on what is right and what needs to be done in this moment. We have a movement to build. We have a lot ahead of us, but we can't fall back into the trap of crying on the shoulders of people who are killing children and expect us to be okay with that. If you have not if that's still not a red line for you, I don't know what to say to you, but I'm just going to move on, because there the majority of humanity is on our side, and the majority of this society is on our side. We just have to move forward. If you want to live in the past and want to relive the halcyon days of the Democratic Party, when it murdered and killed, but you felt good about it, that's on you. You have to live with that. And if you're having feelings, go talk to a therapist about it. Don't talk to me. I have a therapist. I'll go talk to them about my stuff and I'll go work through it. You go work through your own stuff. But in the meantime, let's build something that's better for ourselves, and for our children, for the coming generations, but also for the rest of humanity, because we have to love ourselves in this moment. And loving ourselves does not mean loving the genocider, loving the oppressor. So with that, be well, everyone. Love and solidarity. Take some time out, with your family, be with your family. But tomorrow is, be with your friends and family, however you do it. But tomorrow is a new day. The sun always rises, and the struggle always continues. It's a beautiful struggle. Our ancestors have survived centuries of genocide. And we're in this moment. It's an existential, crisis that we're having as humanity. The world teetering on the brink of collapse. It's a lot to handle. It's a lot to take in. But remember, we can't do it alone. We're not human beings as individuals, or human beings as social creatures in relation to each other and the planet and the universe. Keep that in mind. And stay well, be well.